Welcome everyone for joining us today. Thank you for your interest in this very important topic, especially for us in Washington who are looking at the World Cup coming, who have fisheries, who have seafaring ministries, lots of different places where human trafficking is a very serious reality. I am Jean Hill. I am the Executive Director of the Washington State Catholic Conference, and I'm joined today by my colleague Tracy Yackley with the WSEC and our very special guest, Kat Doyle from the Archdiocese of Atlanta. So let me introduce Kat. I've known Kat since 2011 when she and I were both serving as directors of justice and peace in our respective dioceses. But Kat's been with the Archdiocese since 2003, and she represents her bishops on issues of social concern, is an instructor of Catholic social teaching for the Diocesan Diaconate Formation Program, co-hosts the Archdiocesan Faith and Sustainability podcast, and is the people voice on the People Planet Health vodcast. She's also a subject matter expert on sex, labor, minor, and migrant trafficking and supports the 1 million plus Catholic faithful in North and Central Georgia by educating on raising awareness of and advocating around social justice issues. And we are very grateful to Kat for joining us today. And with that, I will turn it over to Kat.
Thanks so much, Jean, and thank you all for having me. As Jean said, I'm Director of Justice and Peace Ministries, and I am a subject matter expert on trafficking in persons, specifically labor, migrants, minors, and sex. But I also am and am in the process right now of getting my certification on trafficking in persons with disabilities. So there's a big long list of places you can get certified, and those are just some of the ones where I am. Before we get started, I thought that we would begin with a prayer to end human trafficking, and then we can dive into this issue. So, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, God of beauty, freedom, and truth. We believe that your deepest desire, your most powerful energy, is that all creation thrive and enjoy abundant life. We raise our voices in anguished prayer for our sisters and brothers, women and girls, men and boys who are modern day slaves. They are your beloved daughters and sons, exploited sexually or forced to work because of human violence and greed. Fill us with your holy anger and your sacred passion that those who are trafficked might know healing and justice, that traffickers will come to repentance and conversion, that all of us might live in such a way that others are not made to pay for the price of our comfort and convenience. Hasten the day when all people and our precious earth itself will be treated not as a commodity, but as radiant images of your beauty, freedom, and truth. Amen. May it be so. So I want you guys to do something real quick for me, and that is if you have a pen and piece of paper, if you'll write this number down, 888-3737, 888. And I'll come back to that and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But I just wanted to make sure that you all would write that down and just try to remember it for later today. When I asked Jean about this particular presentation, she said that not everybody knew everything about it, that you kind of were all over the board. So I am going to do some basic upper level informational understanding, and then I'll get a little bit deeper into the weeds, if you will, around advocacy. But let's start with trafficking versus smuggling, because this is the place where people go off the tracks at the very beginning. And it's really important to understand the difference that human trafficking, the victim is the person who is being trafficked is the victim of a crime. And human smuggling, the person being smuggled is not a victim. They may become a victim later, but this is a really big difference, especially when we're talking about laws and the legal ramifications of trafficking versus smuggling. So let's take a look at that. when we look at, and I'm going to close this window, when a person voluntarily enters into an agreement for fraudulent documents and or transportation to gain illegal entry into a foreign country and is then moved across an international border. This is important because this is the one with human smuggling where actual travel and transportation takes place, and it is an international crime. So you are not just crossing from one city to another. With human smuggling, it's actually between two different countries. When you look at human smuggling and human trafficking, both of these are really low risk, high profit crimes. And organized criminal businesses are getting into this because there's so much money to be made, and they have absolutely zero regard for human dignity. So human trafficking and human smuggling tend to overlap. And when I talk to a lot of people, they're always surprised that when I'm talking about human trafficking, and when they start talking to me about human smuggling, and I have to stop them and say, we're talking about two different crimes. But both of these make it particularly important that policymakers, law enforcement officers, immigration officers, and civil society organizations, as well as faith based organizations like ours, understand the differences. Because if not, trafficking victims who, remember, are victims of a crime may not receive the protections, the services, and the legal redress which they're entitled. And the need for law enforcement officers for the migrants who come in and out that are processed through our system, if we need to believe them when they say, I've been trafficked to get here. So we need our law enforcement officers to be able to identify migrants who are victims of trafficking versus those who have come into the country without their documents. And so they are not victims of a crime just by coming into the country. They may become victims of a crime, but just smuggling, they've actually committed a crime. The other problem we have is that as people come in, and if they aren't identified as victims and instead are treated as criminal, then they're more vulnerable to being re-exploited because they're not being addressed as victims and then treated as survivors. So you heard what I put about human smuggling. Let's talk about human trafficking. And I know I'm going really fast, so feel free to put your questions in the chat if you didn't get what I said. But we have a lot to cover. Human trafficking is also known as trafficking in persons, and you'll hear that shortened to TIP. So if you hear TIP, TIP, trafficking in persons, we're talking about human trafficking. It's a crime involving the exploitation of an individual for the purpose of compelled labor or a commercial sex act. And here's the important part. It's through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Those of you that might have been following the human trafficking with Epstein and all of that, you probably heard those words, force, fraud, and coercion, because the only way that you can be convicted of a crime is if the person who has been trafficked, who has been exploited, that was done through force, fraud, or coercion. However, and you're going to hear me say however a whole bunch of times because there are lots of little loopholes, and the traffickers know the loopholes and understand them, and the victims and the advocates don't all know the loopholes. So if we want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to advocate on behalf of the victims, we need to make sure we understand all of the little nuances as well. So I thought I'd give you a real quick look at human trafficking. The statistics change for a reason. It is very difficult to figure out exactly how many people are being trafficked and what type of trafficking it is. And there are a whole lot of reasons why. First and foremost, it's a crime. And so people aren't saying, hey, count me when they're committing this crime. And a lot of the money that is being through the transactions is done through cryptocurrency, which is very hard to track and very hard to find statistics for. Also, victims of human trafficking are not very good at either self-identifying or even telling you that they're in a situation where they're a victim. But this is what really, I mean, if you want to see how bad it is, 136 cases of trafficking are reported every hour. Now, this is globally. You can get all of your statistics from your State Department in your state. And some of the leading causes of trafficking, things like war and poverty and politics seem, yep, that makes sense. But there are some cultural norms that actually put people at risk that you may not be aware of. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Somewhere between 40 and 50 million people are trapped in slavery around the world. You'll hear people say all the time, more people are enslaved today than at any time ever in human history. And the types of modern slavery around the world, the three main types are sexual exploitation, which is about 25%. Where I am in Atlanta, it's much higher than that. However, globally, it's about 22 to 25%. Exploitation through labor trafficking is the highest, and that goes anywhere from about 60 to 75%. And a lot of people are surprised to hear this, but there's something called state imposed forced labor, which is a type of labor trafficking. There are actually countries out there who are trafficking their own people. And part of what we're doing with the fight against human trafficking on the global scale is putting the pressure of 188 countries or states around the world, putting pressure on those particular countries that are engaged in state imposed forced labor and get them to stop that. So let me give you kind of a history of how human trafficking came to be defined. And it really came to be defined in great detail starting in 2000. And internationally, you'll hear of the Palermo Protocol. That's kind of the international standard for how we define and talk about human trafficking or trafficking in persons. And nationally here in the United States, we have the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TVPA. That was in 2000. And then in every one of the 50 states and most of the minor outlying islands, we all have cases of human trafficking and laws on the books against human trafficking. However, remember I told you I was going to use that word. A lot of states, their laws are not such that they are keeping anybody from committing the crime. So one of the things we talk about around advocacy is really strengthening what the punishment is for the crime of human trafficking. So I want to just quickly talk about these three ways to really to the Palermo Protocol and the TVPA, because I think it's important for you to understand what these mean. So with the Palermo Protocol, we talk about making sure that the victims are protected, those who are trafficking are prosecuted, and we want to look at prevention from the very beginning. So advocacy and awareness is where that lends into. And that came in 2000. That was voted it was a United Nations meeting in Palermo, Italy, which is where it took place in 2000. The Palermo Protocol went into effect across all of the countries that have signed on today, and there are 188 countries that have signed on today, and that protocol went into effect in 2003. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is about prevention, prosecution, and protection. So the same thing the Palermo is, but we have the specific words that fit our US legal system. It's also important to know the TVPA was voted, President Clinton signed it in 2000, but it has since been renewed. So you'll see the TVPRA. So it is the renewal, and that was in 2003, 2005, 2008. and then VAWA, which are Violence Against Women Act, also renewed the same TVPA thing, but it included some special circumstances for violence against women, and that was in 2012. So you can see that we consistently are keeping this as something that's at the forefront of our US legal system. So let's get down to it. Let's talk about what is labor trafficking, what is sex trafficking, the two most common. And here you'll see that this is the TVPA definition. Labor trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So that's a legal definition. The idea here is that somebody convinces or recruits a person to perform labor or services using force, fraud, or coercion. And that in doing this, here's what's interesting for you to know. They can actually pay them some money, but if the money isn't enough to get them out of their vulnerable position, so the peonage or debt bondage, that sort of thing, then it's still considered labor trafficking. Sex trafficking is very similar. The recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for a commercial sex act, in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. And this is what's really important. If you're under 18 years old, it doesn't matter if they use force, fraud, or coercion. If you have been performing sex and money's being paid to a pimp, a parent, or somebody like that, it is automatically a crime, whether they used force, fraud, or coercion or not. Whoops. So we use this as what's called the AMP model. And this is how, when you get into advocacy, you need to know how the courts are going to look at somebody who is being charged with trafficking, whether it's the trafficker, the seller, or the buyer. We look at what action was taken, what means were used, and what was the purpose. And all three of these things have to be present, and they have to be provable in order for this to actually be tried as a court case and to go to court. So keep this in mind, because this is where the victim and our advocacy for the victim, these three parts of the model become very important. In addition, I talked to you about force, fraud, or coercion, just to give you a little bit better idea what that means. Force is physical assault, sexual assault, including rape, physical confinement or isolation, where they lock you in a room or a container or something like that. Fraud would be fraudulent employment offers. They tell you one thing, they offer you something else. False promises about the type of work you'll be doing or the living conditions that you'll be in, or withholding wages. So telling you, yeah, we'll pay you this, and then not paying you. So that's the fraudulent part. And coercion, a lot of people, force and coercion, it gets a little confusing, but coercion, think of force as physically laying hands on. Coercion or threats to life, when they say something might happen to you or your family members. If you're a migrant, deportation. If you're somebody who thinks that you may have committed a crime, arrest, debt bondage, withholding of legal documents. And here's the biggest one that's used in sex trafficking, and that is psychological manipulation. So keep in mind, and I'll go back to this one, you need to know the action, the means, and the purpose, but you also need to have force, fraud, and coercion present. So let's take a look at what are all the different purposes. That last line right there, we say commercial sex act, labor services. Let's look at what the different purposes are. So the most common, as I told you, was trafficking for forced labor. And I've given you just a few examples of what that forced labor is. One of the biggest things for you to understand about forced labor is that it can be very difficult to see that it's happening, because most of us don't talk to the people that are being trafficked. For instance, the people working in our fields, the women who are cleaning our hotel rooms, the people that are working on construction sites, the janitors working in our buildings at night, the people doing our lawns, our landscaping, all of these areas of are forced labor trafficking. And I also want to tell you that when you look at forced labor trafficking, oftentimes that or not often, most times these are going to the migrant workers are the ones that are going to be doing this forced labor. We know that about 88% of all labor trafficking in the United States is labor trafficking of migrants. So remember, even if they paid somebody to smuggle them in and they've committed the crime, but in doing so, they got themselves into a situation of debt bondage or fraud. Then at that point, they become victims of trafficking. And now they've moved from committing the crime to being a victim of the crime. And the victim is going to take precedence in the court case over when they committed the crime to get into the country. If any of you are lawyers, you know that gets dicey too, and we can dive deeper into that if anybody wants to talk more about that. There's also trafficking for sexual exploitation. This again is using force, fraud, or coercion to get somebody to perform a commercial sexual act. You notice I said commercial sexual act. It does not have to be money that is exchanged. For instance, if somebody, and this is the psychological manipulation, if somebody's promised a runaway teen food, clothing, a place to sleep, a safe place to be from where they've, because they've run away, those are all types of commercial sexual exploitation. The other thing to keep in mind with sexual exploitation is that we know that most people who are trafficked for sex don't wake up and say, yeah, I want to go be a prostitute. So they may be being prostituted. They may have even agreed to it to pay the bills, or in a lot of cases, because they don't, their psychological manipulation has put them in a place that they either don't feel they have any other place to turn, or they just feel like this is who they are. I want to suggest, if you've never read it, look up and read it's a very small short book called The White Umbrella. And the white umbrella is tells you little stories about how people came to be sex trafficked. And then there are stories about how they became survivors. But the thing that made the most impact to me was finding out that a lot of the people who are prostituting themselves are doing so because they were sexually abused at a very young age. And they understand the concept of sex based on the age at which they were first abused. So if you were abused at 6 or 7 or 12 years old, the way you understand and see sex is from that 6 or 7 or 12-year-old's point of view. So when they show up in court and they're 24, and the judge and the jury and even the attorneys don't understand why they do what they do, or why they keep the recidivism of going back to it, a lot of it has to do with the fact that they understand and see what they're doing from an adolescent or a child's viewpoint. I do want to spend just a second to tell you about commercial sexual exploitation of children, or CSEC. The reason I bring this up is that this is always a crime. Anytime you exploit children for sex, it's a crime, period. They are not able to enter into consent. They are not of consensual age, and therefore it is always a crime with children. So the trafficking of children for sex, that doesn't matter what the circumstances are, it's a crime. And that's one of those things. Children cannot agree to be sold for sex. They cannot agree to prostituting themselves because they are not of an age of consent. And that becomes really important, especially in a lot of the advocacy work that we do. There's also, and now we're going to get into some of the smaller things, a little bit more into the weeds. So I'll go really quick on this so that there's time to ask questions. Trafficking for forced criminal activities. These are child soldiers. These are runaways who are forced to beg. These are people who are either helping to produce or transport drugs. So drug mules, that sort of thing. Those people are actually being trafficked if they're being forced to do these criminal activities. And one of the big things in advocacy that we are working on is making sure that when somebody has been forced to commit a crime because they've been trafficked, then we want to make sure that they are treated as a victim and not a criminal. So that's where a lot of advocacy against laws and policy come into play. So let's talk. This one always gets everybody in a little bit of a, gets the hairs on the back of your neck standing up. Trafficking for child marriage, and forced surrogacy. It is, again, against the law for children to enter into marriage. They cannot agree to be married because they are not of age of consent. Then there are plenty of women who are forced into marriage even after age of consent, usually either by threats or by psychological manipulation. And one of the new ones a lot of people haven't heard about is forced surrogacy, where they are forcing women to become pregnant so that they can sell that baby to a couple who it has been having trouble adopting, or they'll put the baby and sell it on the black market. I know all this is sort of hard to hear. I tell people all the time, I know so much about this that I wish I didn't know. This one is, I think, the last one, and that is the human trafficking for organ removal. It's important that you know there's a difference between human trafficking in persons for organ removal and trafficking of organs. Trafficking of organs is the selling of the organ after it's been removed. It could have been removed with consent, without consent, but they're trafficking the organ itself. Human trafficking or trafficking of persons for organ removal is where people are promised either, oh, everybody has 3 kidneys, you can spare one, or people bounce back really quickly from kidney surgery, which is not necessarily true at all. Or they'll tell you things like, this this is $10,000 and it's no big deal, everybody can live with a single kidney. The problem is that most of the people who are trafficked wake up not knowing what they are, with either botched or partial surgeries, and never receive the money that they were promised. And we see this in especially some of the sex tourism areas, where we actually the criminal becomes the victim when they go in and they're paying for sex over in, let's say, one of the sex tourist destinations, and then after they have completed that transaction, they're kidnapped, and then their organs are stolen, and they wake up now having been they're now the victim of a crime. So you enter into a criminal transaction, and you never know when you might end up being the victim yourself. So real quick, who are our traffickers? They can be any demographic, individuals or groups. They can be street gangs and organized crimes. They're actually even businesses and contractors. The main thing to know is they don't look like any particular type of person. And it surprises a lot of people that there are very many women that actually are getting more and more involved in the trafficking of girls for sex. So it isn't just men that are trafficking individuals for sex, and it isn't just men who are trafficking individuals for labor. Human trafficking syndicates, I told you this before, they run like businesses. They understand supply and demand. They have extensive and complex networks and roles. It's like an MBA level of understanding of marketing, recruiting, sales, inventory, security, finance. A lot of them even have their own attorneys. And it's economics 101. There's a customer, there's a trafficker, there's a victim. Where there's demand, there will be supply. Here's the important thing for you to know: that customer at the top, that is the demand. That is where most of the advocacy has been pinpointed, and most advocates believe that this is where we have to focus. Here's why: the victim at the bottom, if you were to save every victim out there today, tomorrow the trafficker would just find all new victims. If we were to take every trafficker off the street today, new traffickers would just come in and take their place. But if we got all the customers off the street, there would no longer be a need for a trafficker, and the trafficker would no longer need that supply or that victim. So keep that in mind when we're looking at advocacy. Who demands these? Who are the people? The top of the level there, the buyers, if you will. Well, there are corporations and governments that are actually demanding low cost labor and raw materials, and they are bringing that labor in from overseas, oftentimes not even realizing that the people that they're bringing in are being trafficked. Small businesses will sometimes use labor, trafficked labor, people for labor, because it's low cost. Households, the domestic workers and the nannies, the au pairs, that sort of thing, sometimes they don't speak the language well, they don't understand, and they're taken advantage of. But there's a line that gets crossed when you take away their legal documents. You don't let them leave, you don't pay them what they're worth, or you put them in a position of debt bondage. And obviously individuals and the demand for both commercial sex and goods and services. Okay, who buys sex? One out of every 5 to 6 men in the United States admit to having purchased commercial sex. Let that sink in. I didn't think that was true. I know lots of people, and I don't think any of them have engaged in commercial sex. However, there are lots of definitions of commercial sex, and what's probably the most important thing to know about this is not one out of every 5 or 6, but a study was conducted, and they do believe that the heavier the penalties for buying sex, and the more publicly known it was that you purchased sex, would deter the buyers. So that's a big place we're looking at here in the United States of doing advocacy as well. Guam, as part of the U.S. territories, has zero laws against buying sex. You don't get in trouble for it. And that's a territory of the U.S. So we do have a lot of work to do. So now we're to the advocacy, and I know this is what you tuned in for, and I know that I'm trying to get it all, cram it all in there, but let's talk about the 4 areas. And if I were doing this in a parish, I would have done what I just did for you in one session, and this advocacy part in another session. So you're getting the speeded up version. So I want you to think about, well, let's go back and look and talk about the 4 areas. There are 4 areas that when you're thinking, okay, how do we stop this? What do we do? And I already told you that there is the customer, the trafficker, and the victim. So the buyer, the seller, and the supply, the demand, the transaction, and the supply. So these are 3 of the 4 areas. So when we look at that and we look at supply, our biggest thing in advocacy is, how do we protect the victim or the survivor? And I want you to think about, when you're talking about a victim and somebody says, what can I do? Do you want to go help rescue them? Do you want to help do the aftercare once they've been rescued? But in advocacy, some of the things that we found that we need help with are walking with the victims as they go through their court case, and understanding that often for victims, there's a lot of psychological trauma because they have to keep telling everybody the story of how they were sold, whether it was for labor or for sex, but specifically for sex. The women and girls are not only made to tell their story over and over, but they're also being humiliated by asking, are you sure Did you really think it was that way? Maybe you seemed a little like you were willing to do it. So they're putting them through a lot of shame and humiliation on this. So our advocacy around supply, around the victim and survivors, starts with walking with the survivors. You do not have to be an attorney to be an advocate for a victim, to walk with them, to be there for them when they do start to fall apart. The other part is advocating for and now that they have been rescued and we consider them survivors, is we want to make sure it can take a long time for a court case, years. And sometimes they get tired of it, they get beat down, they get ashamed and humiliated. They just want to move on. They've gotten out of the bad situation, they just want to move on. So having an advocate that can stay with them through that entire time means that they will be able to testify. If you go back and look at what must you prove in order to testify, the force, fraud, and coercion a lot of times comes from the testimony of the victim or the survivor. So when we look at that, we also want to make sure that victims are never treated as criminals. In my state of Georgia, I've worked with them for years now in making sure that when there was a bust, and here's the woman who's been trafficked in handcuffs with almost nothing on, maybe a t-shirt thrown over her, and the gentleman who purchased her, and I say gentleman in quotes, who purchased her is over chatting with law enforcement. There's something wrong with the situation. We want the laws to make sure that we are not treating victims as criminals, and we are treating the criminals like they should be, meaning that they are prosecuted and there's some sort of penalty for the crime that they've committed. If you move on to the transaction, this is prosecution of the trafficker. This might be the recruiter, the seller, the pimp, depending on what words you're using and what type of crime it might be. This particular one is the easiest of all of the three. If you look at the victim, the perpetrator, or the buyer, and the seller is kind of the easiest to go after. Pretty much everybody believes if you're selling people, it's wrong when you get into a courtroom with a judge and a jury. The buyer and the victim can get dicey, but pretty much everybody believes if you're selling someone and making a profit off of it, that you're probably guilty of a crime. Here's where we want to make sure that the crime fits, the punishment fits the crime, that we're making sure that those people that have been trafficking multiple people, those people who have been trafficking and making large sums of money. Because remember, the difference between trafficking drugs or weapons is you have to find more drugs, make more drugs, or find new weapons in order to sell them again. With a human being, you can sell the same person over and over and over again. That is a crime against humanity, and we need to make sure that our laws say that. When I first started this work, a mom and a dad sold their child for sex to the owner of a used car place so that they could get a van that they couldn't afford. They got the van, and every week they let this man have sex with their daughter. When they were caught and punished, they each got less than a year in jail. Today, if they were to do that same thing in our state, they would get at least 10 years. So that's the type of legislative advocacy we're looking for. And I'm getting close to being done. The last one is demand. And this, my friends, is where you can have the most input and do the most good. This is the prosecution of the customer, the buyer, the John. This is where, in times past, it literally has been a slap on the wrist. Don't do it again. In some places, there's no punishment at all. We have found, and I showed you that, or told you that the study shows that if we, and shame is not a really Christian word to use, but if we are to make sure that people know that somebody has been caught buying sex, especially from a minor, if we were to post those names in the newspaper and make sure that people knew about it, people say that they would be a lot less willing to take the chance of getting caught if everybody was going to find out. The other thing with demand is, and this is where we need to really push, is that demand is one of those things that when you're going to church on a Sunday morning, there are people in your Catholic parish sitting in the pews with you that are buying sex. So if we start talking about why we shouldn't be doing this and who it's hurting, and that it goes against our Catholic belief in the dignity of the human person, then we begin to address those things differently than maybe those men have, mostly men, have been seeing them. So I want you to think about the fact it's not just changing the law or changing the policy, but it's changing the expectations. This is that social thing that I told you about way back in the beginning of this thing, where I said that social norms have changed, and they're actually the first step, the most common way that people are getting, especially into sex trafficking, that it's just accepted socially. Boys will be boys, men are going to do this, and we need to change that. And we can do that in our church, and we can do that through advocacy. There are a few circumstances that I want to cover with you, and then we'll take questions if that's okay, Jean. I would like to, at this point, talk about things like this is not the buyer, the seller, or the victim, but for instance, we've been working on asking Pornhub, which is a pornography site, we asked Visa to no longer allow Pornhub to take Visa credit cards for people to buy into that pornography site. That's one way. That's just a special circumstance. It is raising awareness, training people. We want to make sure that every teacher, every law enforcement, every healthcare worker, everybody who may come in contact in the hospitality industry, in the agricultural industry, if they're aware of what's going on and we're making them aware of that, it's less likely that actual trafficking will take place. And finally, one part of advocacy is prevention, and prevention starts with education and awareness, which means offering things like this to people in your parishes, in your social groups, wherever there's a group of people that might come together that might be interested in learning more. Online exploitation in this, then we'll go into questions. In 2020, online recruitment increased 22%, 125% increase in reports of recruitment over Facebook, and 95% with Instagram. The TIP report this year, this past June, it was released in June, Traffic in Persons report said that it was the number one issue that needed to be discussed and was of concern, because more than 60% of the people who are being trafficked for sex, the meetup or the recruitment is taking place online on social media sites. So the last two I'll just say, and that is that in our church, we are significantly aware that trafficking of migrants and trafficking of persons with disabilities are rising. And we actually have ministries in our parishes that are beginning to get trained and to understand this. So you can also look into advocacy in those areas. So now we're to, if you have questions, I will tell you that there are two areas, there are two organizations I would really tell you to talk to. The first is the Alliance to End Human Trafficking. It was founded and supported by the U.S. Catholic Sisters. And they're easy to find. Just put Catholic Sisters Against Trafficking and they'll come up. They have a robust staff of people covering lots of things. And the other is the Polaris Project. Remember the number I asked you to write down? I really would like you to put that in your cell phones now. 888-3737, 888 is the human trafficking hotline. If you see something and you just aren't sure, law enforcement and Polaris will tell you, call us anyway, because that's how we begin to see trends and that's how we save lives. All right. There you go, Jean. What are some questions?
Excellent, Kat. Thank you so much. So first and foremost, what are some basic actions we could take now if we want to raise some awareness?
So I think that the first thing I would tell you if you want to raise awareness is those two, Polaris and the U.S. Sisters, they have presentations already made out, or they'll even come and give the presentations. So there are plenty of people like me in these organizations that will help you make sure that you have a presentation. What I think is more important is, and where we're working in my diocese is, we have a goal by the end of 2026. Every single parish will have held an informational human trafficking meeting, and not just for the parish, but we want them to invite the community. We want them to bring in local law enforcement so they can tell you what's really going on. So that's one thing. Another thing that you can do is every state, I'm pretty sure every state during their legislative session has a human trafficking awareness day. It usually, Human Trafficking Awareness Day for globally is on January 15th, but every state typically has a group of people that show up at the state house during the legislative session to talk to the legislators about human trafficking. The great thing about this is, and I'm proof of this, that we showed up enough times that I think they got tired of hearing from us with lots of people, and they just help change things. There's also, when you're looking within your parishes, and this is a simple one that I'll give you that I've done in a couple of parishes. Most of us know that there are illicit massage parlors, like almost on every corner. They might say massage or spa and all this sort of thing. And so when one of those has been identified as being an illicit massage parlor, we've gotten small ministry, a group of people at a parish, typically 30 people or less. And once close of business has taken place, so let's say after 6 o'clock, they have a script. Each one of those 30 people has called the sheriff or the police, depends upon whether you're county or city, but called into law enforcement and said they are concerned about this. They believe that they want somebody to go check it out and all that. Well, police chiefs and sheriffs are elected and appointed positions, and they listen to their constituents. With 30 people pick up the phone and say, we're worried about this massage parlor down the street, the next day the police are in there checking it out. And the two times we've done that, we've closed down the massage parlor within the week. So that's just, but it's easy to, you don't have to talk to anybody. It's the same message. And literally went, because the police chief and the sheriff, they take those messages and give them to him, and he's going to be like, what the heck is going on here and all that? You guys get out, check this out. Because we start off by saying, I'm a constituent, I live here, and I want this taken care of. So
Nice.
there's one.
And tell me, you were talking to me earlier before this began about your stickers and how you send out families. Tell us a little bit
Yes.
about the stickers.
So there's a great organization in our backyard which really deals with things like the Super Bowl and the World Cup, those sporting events, which we know that sporting events are the number one place that the most money is spent on sex trafficking. So we had the Super Bowl in Atlanta, and this particular organization does a bunch of different things with the hotels to make the hotels aware of what to look for. We trained the Uber drivers and the Lyft drivers so they knew what to look for when people got into their cars. But we also went to all the convenience stores, and we asked the convenience stores if we could put stickers in their bathroom stalls. And you guys have probably seen these in a lot of bathroom stalls. 888-3737, 888. Next time you go, you'll know what that number is. But so we went around and put those in the sticker in those convenience stores all around the stadium. Well, after that, I literally ordered 10,000 stickers, and I'm working with my college ministry groups. And when college starts each year, they take a handful of those stickers and they go to the bars and the laundromats and other places that the college kids might hang out, and look up sugaring or sugaring sugar babies in on college campuses. Unfortunately, in Georgia, Georgia State College is the number one campus for sugaring or sugar babies. It's where women start out by just accompanying men on dates and end up getting paid to have sex. And at first it seems okay, but then they get stuck and they can't get out of it. And then the men start forcing them to do other things. So we went to all these campuses and we put these stickers out in there. We also had family ministries that went out and as a family went into the convenience stores outside of the downtown area. Dad and son went into the men's room, mom and daughter went into the ladies' room, asked if they could put the stickers up, and then explained to the people in the convenience store why this was important. Convenience Store Owners of America organization is aware of this and they know they're pushing it and they're behind this. There's also Truckers Against Trafficking. There's all these different organizations. So if you're looking for something specific to do, and typically this is why I say I'd normally come and sit down with you and figure out what you're going to do for advocacy, but I'm also happy to talk with you and give you ideas individually as well.
Perfect. Thank you. And please, again, if you have questions, feel free to put those in the chat. I have one more for you, and that is because we are, Washington is ahead of the game in many ways in terms of state laws, but we are also ahead of the game because we have a lot of the common factors that really increase trafficking, like being a port city, like having a lot of immigrants come through because of our rural agricultural needs and all of the other businesses and entities we've got. Tell us a little bit about, as a port city, what are some of the unique trafficking situations in that kind of an area?
So the U.S. Sisters have been involved in this for a long time, and it is for the seafaring industry. It's a very old practice. It's been going on since shipping started, and that is where they will Shanghai or hijack men in developing countries who are hanging out at the ports looking for work, that sort of stuff. Shanghai them, put them on fishing boats, and put them out to sea. Now, I will tell you that it doesn't happen a lot in the United States. We have lots of law enforcement and security that keeps that from happening. The problem is this: those men are put on those boats and put out to sea, and they're forced to do the fishing industry. It's difficult, it's dangerous, it is physically exhausting. So these men are put on these boats and they're never given the opportunity to come back into land because the buyers of the fish send their boats out into the ocean to meet up with the boats where the men who are being held captive are. They offload the catch onto the boat that then comes back in to your port, and now they have fish to sell to the fisheries industry. So what happens is if we don't demand transparency in our supply chain, if we don't say to and Bumblebee Tuna is one of the ones we worked with, if we don't say to them, are you catching your tuna or are you buying it from a boat offshore? If you're buying it from a boat offshore, why are you doing that? Why are you not making that transaction in a place where it can be seen and it can be registered? It makes your supply chain transparent. And if we demand this and we say we're not going to buy from the companies who aren't willing to be transparent in their supply chain, then if we simply say, oh, we don't see it, we don't know about it, whatever, then we're complicit and actually living off of that. I also want to tell you that I haven't even touched on the international side of things. So the international side of thing, every one of us who own a cell phone are complicit and actually use that cell phone because slave labor, human trafficking has mined the cobalt that goes into those batteries. Same with our EV. So I'm not saying don't use a cell phone or don't use an EV, but I want you to be aware of, because we can start demanding of our EV battery makers and and this is the policy part of advocacy, of our cell phone battery makers, we want you to purchase cobalt that's been mined by people who've been paid a fair wage. Well, if there isn't enough out there and we refuse to buy, most of it's mined in the Congo, we refuse to buy from them because they're using slave labor. So nobody's buying their cobalt. They're going to have to make some kind of a change. or we're going to see more workers go to mines where they are paying a fair wage instead of that. So, and we have International Justice Mission is one that works around the country. They work on rescuing slaves from places like that. They work with those states where they're trying to tighten up the penalties and have good laws. Those places where state sponsored trafficking is taking place, trying to meet with them and work through things with that. So just know that I barely touched on the US, let alone the international side of things. You guys also have one other thing that's agricultural. And with the agricultural trade, we as a nation used to let farmers come in and do migrant farming up the coast and back down and then go home. When we stopped doing that, because we weren't giving them that visa, that farm worker migrant visa, and now they're having to make the decision to stay in the country without documentation or without status when they or they're crossing the border irregularly to do the work and they choose to stay here. Again, they've committed the crime by being here, but it makes them very vulnerable in the fact that now, and I live in a place where we have chicken farming up in the agricultural, and so we have all these migrants, and the chicken farmers like build the wall, make the migrants go home, make them come in the right way. And yet they're paying them for like less than $1 an hour in some cases because they know they're illegal. It's like you either work for me or I'll turn you in. So that's the type of thing that when I say businesses are doing this, these are upstanding business owners that are saying, I'm a good citizen, I do all this, and yet they're exploiting. And they'll say, I'm not trafficking them, I'm paying them. But remember, if you're paying them and forcing them to do it or using fraud or coercion to make them do the work, it's still human trafficking. And you guys have a lot of that too.
Oh yeah, thank you for that. And one of the bills, just for my Washington folks, one of the bills we did advocate in support of this past session that didn't pass was to provide some protections for domestic workers who are hired by a family, and then their pay is withheld. They're not allowed to. They say they're going to take a vacation. They're told that's fine. They take the vacation, they get back, and are told we're not going to pay you because you left without letting us know. Just a lot of different ways to engage in exploitation of workers that can amount to trafficking and labor as well.
Jean, do you have a safe harbor law
We
in your
do.
state?
Yeah, we do.
Oh, okay. And for those, I mean, we worked really hard as a Catholic Church to help get the safe harbor law passed. It's a constitutional amendment for us in Georgia, and that those businesses or organizations that in some way create the atmosphere of the possibility of sex trafficking, so a strip club or a exotic toy store, something like that, they have to pay an additional fee in their licensing. And then anybody who's convicted of a sex trafficking crime, the fines that they have to pay all go into this, and this money is then paid out to the survivors, starting with the children survivors, child survivors. So we're making sure that the people who are making this possible are the ones funding aftercare for the survivors. It's all over the board. All I can tell you is I could do a whole semester on this in a college class. So what I've told you, if you feel like, oh my gosh, that's not unusual to feel that way. And if you're thinking, what am I supposed to do? My best advice for you is this: think about which area are you interested in working with, the survivors and the victims, the buyer, the seller, or other legislative and policy issues. Once you know that, then you can start looking at specifically what you can do. But there's way too many for me to just start throwing them out.
Well, we really appreciate you helping us at least dip our toes in right now. Again,
Now,
thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Kat. I hope you make your flight.
thank you for the opportunity to raise awareness today.
It was beautiful. Thank you.